The rain poured heavily over the city, but the luxurious atmosphere of the banquet hall was immune to the weather outside. Beatriz's wedding, Daniel's ex-girlfriend, was about to take place, and all eyes were on her. But there was something unusual about the event. Daniel, dressed in a designer jacket and with a serious expression, was sitting at the back of the hall, not with any glamorous guest, but with a woman who seemed completely out of place in this sophisticated environment. Clara, a homeless woman, wore a simple dress that barely hid the scars of her life on the streets, and her eyes, marked by pain, were fixed on the altar, although her body seemed tense, as if she still couldn't believe she was there. Welcome. I'm Marcos Paulo, the storyteller. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and comment from which city you are watching. Daniel looked at Clara, noticing her posture, and wondered if he had made the right choice, inviting her to this important event. Beatriz, his ex, would certainly not be happy with the presence of a woman like Clara, and the way people were beginning to look at her worried him. He knew the situation was about to get uncomfortable, but there was something in Clara's gaze that made him continue. She seemed to be the only person present who wasn't trying to hide her weaknesses. She somehow brought an authenticity that he had never found in Beatriz, nor in the other people from his circle. When the guests' gazes began to turn toward Clara, Daniel knew the situation was about to spiral out of control. He braced for the worst, but Clara, surprisingly calm, remained steady. He thought maybe she didn't know what was coming, but when she looked at him and gave him a shy smile, he understood that she knew exactly what she was doing. She was there for a reason, and he couldn't deny that, in some way, she seemed to be preparing for a confrontation he hadn't anticipated. What would happen now? What would Clara do? What no one knew was that Clara was not just a homeless woman. She had a story of betrayal, pain, and loss that connected Beatriz and Daniel in a way no one could have imagined. Appearances can be deceiving, and Clara knew that very well. She was no longer the woman Beatriz thought she was. She had an ace up her sleeve, a revelation that would make all the difference, and at this wedding in front of all the guests and an arrogant ex-girlfriend, Clara was about to turn the tables. How? No one knew. But somehow, she knew this would be the perfect moment. Daniel had always had everything he could wish for. At 35 years old, he was a successful businessman with a fortune built through sweat and determination. He owned a luxury mansion, high-end cars, and traveled to the most exclusive places in the world. But despite all his material accomplishments, there was an immense emptiness inside him, a space that he could never fill, even with all the wealth he had accumulated. He never imagined that after so many years of hard work, the biggest challenge of his life wouldn't be related to work or business, but to his personal life, which had been shattered by a relationship with Beatriz. Beatriz and Daniel had been the perfect couple, or at least it seemed that way to others. But behind closed doors, their relationship was far from ideal. Beatriz, though charming and charismatic, had an obsessive control over Daniel, manipulating him in ways he only realized too late. She always made him feel inferior, insecure, and the pain of the betrayal he suffered during their relationship still haunted him. When Beatriz left him, he felt broken, as if life had left him behind. But what he didn't know at the time was that the real pain was yet to come, and it would be caused by a woman much more unexpected. Gradually, Daniel rebuilt himself, but he never found true happiness. After the breakup with Beatriz, he withdrew from everyone around him, building a wall of solitude. No one really knew who he was. His friends and colleagues only saw the rich and successful man, but inside he was lost. He tried to move on, getting involved with other people, but he could never forget the shadow of Beatriz. He felt that she still controlled him, still tormented him in some way, even after all this time, and so he began searching for something, someone who could give new meaning to his life. That's when he met Clara. She was sitting on the sidewalk with a distant look in her eyes, as if carrying the weight of a world Daniel couldn't imagine. Her homelessness was obvious, but there was something about her that attracted him. Unlike Beatriz, Clara wasn't trying to be anyone other than herself. She had a quiet strength, something Daniel immediately recognized. He knew Clara wasn't just any woman. She wasn't a woman with a superficial story, like so many others he had been involved with. She seemed to have a depth that he had always sought, but never found. Maybe it was because she had suffered in a way he couldn't comprehend, but somehow it made him want to help. And that's how he invited Clara to Beatriz's wedding. He knew this decision might cause a scandal, but he also knew that somehow it would make Beatriz and everyone else see who he truly was, and maybe even help him understand who he had become. He was tired of living in the shadow of past choices, and Clara, with her simple and genuine presence, seemed to be the key for him to finally break free. Little did Daniel know that by bringing Clara to this event, he was about to witness something far greater than a simple act of revenge. He was about to discover the true strength of a woman who he never imagined could challenge Beatriz so profoundly. The room was filled with whispered conversations and muffled laughter, but as soon as Daniel and Clara entered the wedding hall, everything fell silent. All eyes turned to them, especially Clara, who seemed out of place among the elegantly dressed guests. Clara, in her simple dress and slightly windswept hair, looked around, feeling the weight of judgmental stares on her. She was no longer the dirty woman from the streets, but a woman with a history that no one there understood. She felt the discomfort of everyone present, and for a moment she thought about leaving, but Daniel's hand tightened around hers, as if it was the only steady thing she could hold on to at that moment. Beatriz, upon realizing who Daniel had brought with him, froze. She didn't know what to think when she saw the woman he had chosen to accompany him. The idea of being replaced by someone so simple, so far removed from the beauty and wealth standards she always valued, made her furious. Anger grew inside her. She never imagined that Daniel, after everything he had been through with her, would bring a woman like Clara to his wedding. And it was there, in front of everyone, that the first confrontation between them occurred. Beatriz approached with a forced smile, her voice sweet but full of venom. "Daniel, I didn't know you had changed so much. Who is this friend?" The words dropped heavily in the air, and all eyes turned to Clara, who was now at the mercy of the question. Without hesitation, Clara looked directly at Beatriz, not feeling the need to submit to her superior gaze. She knew exactly what was happening. Beatriz's attempt to humiliate her there, in front of everyone, would not succeed. Clara, with a calm tone, responded, "I'm just someone Daniel decided to invite. But if you want to know more, I can tell you a bit about what happened after you left him." Shock filled the room. Clara's words landed like a punch in Beatriz's stomach, who, for a moment, was left speechless. Daniel remained silent, feeling a mixture of pride and regret. He knew Clara was about to expose more than he had imagined, but something inside him told him that she had every right to speak the truth. Beatriz, for her part, tried to recover, but Clara's words had struck her at her weakest point. The truth she feared was about to be revealed, and she had no control over it. But instead of retreating, Beatriz stepped even closer to Clara, trying to destabilize her with a cold smile. "You don't know who you're dealing with, do you? You can try to expose whatever you want, but the truth will never be on your side," she said with a threatening tone. It was then that Daniel realized that although Clara seemed like a vulnerable woman, she was the only one in that room capable of breaking the lies he had lived with for years. He knew she had something powerful, something that couldn't be ignored. While Beatriz tried to put more pressure on Clara, Daniel decided to intervene. "Beatriz, enough. You have no room to manipulate anyone here anymore. It's time to stop hiding the truth." The impact of these words was immediate. Beatriz was left speechless, and murmurs filled the room. It was the beginning of the end of her facade. But what no one knew was that, in addition to exposing Beatriz, Clara was about to reveal something even more shocking, something Daniel never imagined would be part of this story. A truth he didn't know, but that now, in the midst of this confrontation, was about to come to light. The atmosphere in the hall was tense. Clara could feel Beatrice's icy stares on her, but her posture didn't falter. She was no longer afraid. What she was about to do could change everything, but she was determined not to be intimidated, not by Beatriz, nor by the uncomfortable situation she found herself in. However, the silence of the guests was deafening, as if everyone was waiting for the moment of explosion, and of course, it came. Beatriz, still with her forced smile, approached Clara. "You really think you have a chance here, don't you? You're at my wedding, at my party with Daniel, and you think this is going to change anything? Who do you think you are?" The words fell like sharp knives, and although Clara knew they were just attempts to humiliate her, part of her felt the sting of that attack. But instead of giving in, Clara stood taller, her eyes steady, and her voice calm. "I am someone who is tired of living in the shadows of lies. Someone who is finally ready to show the truth about you, about Daniel, and about both of us." Clara's tone made everyone around stop to listen. Beatrice's gaze hardened, but she knew that Clara's words were beginning to have an impact. Clara, in turn, knew this was the decisive moment, the point at which she could finally expose all the pain and lies. But something deeper was happening inside her, the realization that, regardless of how Beatrice reacted, she no longer needed anyone's approval. She had found her own strength. Daniel, on his part, was in shock. He watched Clara, realizing the intensity and sincerity in her words, and at the same time, he felt ashamed for never seeing this woman, his friend, with the eyes he now had. Clara was not just a homeless woman, a figure of no importance. She was someone who, despite everything she had gone through, stood firm. He now saw that she possessed a resilience he never imagined finding. Watching Clara's humiliation dissipate into courage, he felt a deep admiration for her, but also a sense of loss, because while she blossomed, he remembered that his own pain, until that moment, had been ignored, swept under the rug. Beatrice was no longer the controlling woman she appeared to be. The power she thought she had over everyone was fading with every word Clara spoke, and when the homeless woman confronted her one last time with a painful truth, Beatrice knew there was no going back. The humiliation Clara had caused was deep, but what truly shook Beatrice was the reality that Clara had more control over the situation than she ever imagined. And realizing this, Beatrice's true defeat began to take form. Clara turned to Daniel, her eyes still calm but now filled with a new confidence. She no longer needed Beatrice's words to feel validated. "I know what you're thinking, Daniel, but the truth is, if you hadn't brought me here, if you hadn't given me the chance to be who I am today, maybe I'd still be stuck in that cycle of pain and silence. Thank you for showing me that freedom doesn't come from material goods or status, but from the courage to be who you truly are, regardless of how others see you." As Clara's words still echoed in the room, Beatrice struggled to control her emotions, but was losing the game. Her mask was falling off, and she knew she couldn't manipulate anyone anymore. The image of perfection she had created was disintegrating in front of all the guests. The humiliation was too high a price to pay for her lies, and now Clara was becoming the true protagonist of the story, someone capable of turning pain into strength, lies into truth. The wedding, which should have been Beatrice's grand moment, now seemed like a stage of chaos. As the guests began to murmur among themselves, Clara and Daniel stepped away from the center of attention, but the tension was still in the air. Clara, unlike what many imagined, didn't seem shaken by what was happening. She was, in some way, at peace. The weight of the humiliation Beatrice had tried to impose on her faded as the words of truth and courage made their way through. Daniel, who had always been a man of action with little reflection, was now immersed in thoughts. He knew his life was about to take a very different turn, and it all started at that moment. What had initially seemed like an event to confront his past with Beatrice had turned into a process of self-discovery for him too. As he watched Clara, he finally saw the real strength she carried, a strength that, for a long time he had, but didn't know how to recognize in himself. Clara, stepping away from everyone, found a quiet corner in the venue's garden. The soft light of the late afternoon illuminated her face, and for a moment, she allowed herself to take a deep breath. It wasn't about what she had done at the wedding, but about who she was becoming. The pain of the past, the nights at the shelter, the days not knowing where to sleep, all of it now seemed like part of who she was, but no longer the definition of who she would be. She was ready to begin again. She knew the fight was not over, but now she had something she didn't have before, the certainty of her own voice, her own power. Daniel approached her, hesitant, but with a clear decision in his eyes. "Clara, I don't know what to do with all of this. I never imagined it could get out of control like this. But one thing I know is, you're not the person I thought you were. And more importantly, you've made me see things I never thought I'd be able to see." Clara looked at him without words, but with a calm smile. She knew he was trying to understand himself, just as she herself was trying to figure out the new path that was opening up for both of them. Their conversation was brief, but full of meaning. That was a turning point, not just for Clara, but also for Daniel. He knew that the woman at his side now wasn't the same woman he had known days ago. Clara no longer needed him to prove her worth. She had found her own strength and her own story, and he, although he had lost a part of his old self, was now on a path of rebuilding alongside her. The idea of leaving the wedding crossed their minds, but Clara hesitated. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that the first time she truly felt free was when she decided to be honest with herself. The shame, the fear of judgment, all of that disappeared when she freed herself from others' expectations, and that was something she would carry forever, her own truth. Daniel, looking at Clara, finally understood. He couldn't live under the shadow of his past anymore, or of what Beatriz expected from him. He would need to find his own truth, just like Clara did. Maybe together they could rebuild their lives, not based on external expectations, but on what it really meant to be free, authentic, and courageous. When the night fell, Clara and Daniel left the wedding together, leaving behind the confusion and chaos, but carrying something far more valuable, the opportunity to begin again. No longer afraid to expose the truth, but with the courage to live with it. In the days following the wedding, the impact of what had happened still resonated in Daniel. He was constantly reflecting, analyzing not only the dynamic of his relationship with Beatriz, but also the profound change that was happening inside of him. He spent the next few days distancing himself from his usual routine, working less and reflecting more. The luxury, fame, and material possessions, which had always been the pillars of his life, now seemed empty and purposeless. He began to realize that what he truly sought was something Clara had in abundance: authenticity. Clara, in turn, was on a similar path, but on a completely different journey. After the revelation at the wedding, she had returned to her old routine, but now with a new perspective. She was no longer the woman who hid in the shadows of the city, struggling to survive. She now knew who she truly was, and the weight of her past, which had once consumed her, was now becoming a source of strength. Clara felt ready to rebuild her life, to look for a new beginning, far from the pain of the past. She sought a shelter that would help her rise again, without needing anyone to impose on her how she should live. What motivated her now was the desire to grow and turn the pain into something productive, something that would take her to new horizons. Clara knew that in some way she needed to prove to herself that she was not defined by her current situation. She was not a homeless woman without a future. She was someone who had the capacity to change her own life. Daniel, seeing how determined Clara was to make her life work, felt an impulse to support her. He didn't know exactly what he could do to help her, but somehow he knew he needed to be by her side. His own journey of self-discovery was intertwined with hers. With every conversation they had, every encounter, Daniel felt that even though Clara was on a path of transformation, he was too. She challenged him to look at his own weaknesses, to face the lies he had been telling himself about his life. He could no longer live with the facade that everything was fine when, in reality, he had been running from his own truths. Time passed, and Clara began to settle into a small house she had found. She transformed that simple place into a refuge where she could finally live with dignity and peace. Daniel visited her often, helping with small things like fixing the paint on the walls and arranging the furniture. But more importantly, he was there to support her emotionally. Their connection was growing, and he could no longer deny what was happening. He was falling in love with her, not the woman he thought she was, but the woman she really was. The strength, courage, and peace that Clara now exuded made Daniel see the world in a completely new way. They began to share more about their pasts, their pains, their regrets, and little by little, they discovered that despite their differences, they were both on a similar journey, the search for truth and freedom. Their friendship was turning into something deeper, but both were aware that the foundation of everything they were building was honesty, respect, and trust. Neither of them was ready to define what they could be, but both knew that together they could build something much stronger than anything they had ever lived through. Daniel also started to take steps towards his own reconstruction. He began making changes in his life, distancing himself from friends and colleagues who were more interested in his money than in his happiness. He made new friends, those based on deeper values, and who helped him understand that true wealth doesn't lie in possessions, but in human connections and self-awareness. Clara and Daniel knew they didn't have all the answers, but as time passed, they realized their journey was far from over. The path of overcoming wasn't easy, but with each step they took, they became stronger, freer, more authentic, and life now seemed to be aligning in a way they both had never imagined. As Clara and Daniel delved deeper into their new lives, the past, as expected, did not take long to make its presence felt in an unexpected way. One morning, Clara received a registered letter. She hesitated before opening it. The envelope seemed too formal to be something simple. When she finally opened it, her heart nearly stopped. The letter was from Beatriz. No, it wasn't just a piece of correspondence. It was a veiled threat. Beatriz, after the humiliation at the wedding, was determined to destroy what Clara and Daniel had built, and more than that, she now wanted Clara gone by any means necessary. "You're playing with fire. You know what I'm capable of. The life you're trying to build won't last. You don't belong here, not near Daniel. I'll do everything I can to make you understand that. Be careful." The text was short, but loaded with toxic venom. Clara didn't know how Beatriz had found out about her new life, but the message was clear. Beatriz wasn't going to leave her in peace. She felt the weight of her isolation return with force, and the growing tension made her question everything she had accomplished up until that point. What would she do now? How would she face someone with the power to destroy her peace? Daniel immediately noticed the change in Clara's behavior. She became more withdrawn, more thoughtful. He knew something was wrong, but didn't know what. When she finally shared the letter with him, Daniel felt a deep anger rise within him. He knew that Beatriz had her methods of controlling and manipulating people around her, but he never imagined she could be this cruel. The letter was a clear attempt to pressure Clara, to place her back in the position of victim. But Clara, with her renewed courage, would no longer be that woman. "I'm not going to let her destroy me, Daniel. I've been through worse. She can try to bring me down, but I won't let it. I won't give in." "Not now," Clara said, her voice firm. But inside, she felt a growing tension. Beatriz's threat seemed impossible to ignore, and the feeling that her new beginning was about to be ripped away terrified her. Clara found herself once again on the edge of an abyss, but instead of retreating, she decided to move forward, stronger than before. She knew that what Beatriz wanted was to see her give up, and she would not allow that. But Beatriz's attack didn't end with just a letter. In the following days, Clara began receiving anonymous calls, veiled threats in text messages, and even unexpected encounters with people who seemed always one step ahead, watching her every move. The psychological pressure was immense, and Clara felt that the situation was spiraling out of control. She could no longer trust anyone, and paranoia began to take over her thoughts. She knew that if Beatriz had something against her, she would go to any lengths. What could Daniel do to protect her from someone so relentless? Daniel, on the other hand, wasn't willing to bend to Beatriz's threats. He knew he needed to act. He knew he had to protect Clara by any means possible. But at the same time, he found himself trapped between the love he felt for her and the need to confront the shadows of his own past. The confrontation with Beatriz was inevitable, and he felt that by facing this, he wasn't just fighting for Clara, but for his own redemption. The situation reached its peak when Clara was confronted in person by one of Beatriz's allies in an empty street. The tension in the air was palpable, and Clara felt physically threatened. She didn't know if she could defend herself, but in a moment of pure courage, she faced her aggressor, and with an energy she never imagined she had, managed to escape the situation. But the fear remained, and she knew that this battle was far from won. The consequences of fighting Beatriz would only intensify. Now, more than ever, Clara felt that she was in a war she couldn't lose. She no longer wanted to be a victim, and this time she would fight head-on, without hiding. But as she began to prepare herself to face Beatriz on her own terms, a doubt lingered over her. What would she have to sacrifice to finally live the life she had always wanted? Would she be willing to face whatever was necessary, or would Beatriz be the winner in the end? The tension between Clara and Beatriz escalated quickly, but just as the situation seemed to be reaching its breaking point, something unexpected happened. A mysterious ally emerged from Daniel's past, someone he never expected to encounter, but who now became a key piece to resolve what was to come. This ally was Marcos, Daniel's trusted lawyer, who had worked with him on several negotiations and business disputes. Marcos had distanced himself from Daniel after some disagreements, but now he reappeared, bringing vital information. Marcos showed up at Clara's house without warning on a rainy day. He seemed nervous, but there was an urgency in his eyes that caught Clara's attention. He explained that since the fight between Daniel and Beatriz, he had kept his distance, but had heard about everything that was happening. The most shocking thing he revealed was that Beatriz was more involved in illegal activities than Daniel could ever imagine. The threats Clara had been receiving weren't just psychological power plays, but part of a well-planned strategy. Beatriz had a network of influence, including people within the police and government who were helping to protect her secrets. Beatriz isn't just trying to manipulate you, Clara. She's desperate. What she fears more than anything is the truth being exposed. She has much more to lose than you realize, and she won't stop until she ensures her past never comes to light, Marcos said, his tone serious. Clara listened to every word attentively, feeling the weight of the situation grow even heavier. What Daniel and she were facing now wasn't just a power struggle between ex-lovers. It was a fight for survival, where the truth might be the only key to winning. "So what should we do?" Clara asked, her voice trembling with anxiety but also determination. She knew she couldn't continue being a puppet in Beatriz's hands. Marcos, with his legal knowledge and access to valuable information, offered to help. He proposed that they find legal ways to expose Beatriz by gathering evidence and testimonies that would directly link her to criminal activities. This would be the only way to bring her down without engaging in a direct confrontation, which could be fatal. Daniel, who until that moment had felt lost and without options, now saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Marcos's presence and the information he brought gave him a chance to actually confront Beatriz and finally expose everything she had hidden. Clara, although hesitant, began to see a possible path ahead. She knew she could no longer remain at the mercy of Beatriz's threats, but she also knew that the road to the truth would not be easy. Marcos revealed even more shocking details that were a surprise to everyone. He disclosed that Beatriz wasn't just manipulating the people around her. She was also involved in a series of frauds that affected many lives. There was a money laundering scheme, and the real reason Beatriz wanted to control Daniel was to maintain her empire of lies and corruption. Beatriz feared that if Daniel learned the truth, it would mean the end of her network. From that moment on, Clara and Daniel knew that they weren't just fighting for a new beginning, but for justice, the truth, and the freedom of all those who had been harmed by Beatriz. With this revelation, the decision was made. They could no longer wait. The plan of action was set in motion, and now, with Marcos's support, Daniel and Clara were ready to go all the way. The first step would be to gather all the necessary evidence to expose Beatriz and ensure she was brought to justice. It was a fight for the truth, a battle that would require courage, determination, and sacrifices. But Clara already knew what was at stake: her own freedom, and more importantly, the chance to rebuild her life without the weight of the past. With Marcos's support and the courage Clara had found within herself, she knew she was ready to finally face Beatriz. The war had been declared, and although fear was still present, Clara no longer felt alone. She now had a mission: to show the world Beatriz's true face, and in doing so, free herself and Daniel from the chains of the past. With the plan set and preparations made, Clara and Daniel, along with Marcos, set out for the final confrontation. The air was thick with tension as they headed to the location where Beatriz was gathering her network of allies. The truth was about to be exposed, but fear still lingered in the air. Clara, although determined, knew that the battle they were about to face wouldn't just be against Beatriz, but against the entire system of manipulation and lies she had built over the years. Beatriz's office was located in a sophisticated building in the city center, a place where it seemed that nothing bad could ever happen. But Clara knew that this was where all the lies came together and where Beatriz's true face needed to be revealed. Marcos had prepared a legal strategy that would allow them to expose the fraud without putting their own lives at risk. They had documents, recordings, and testimonies ready to be handed over to the authorities. But the biggest challenge would be making Beatriz believe that the game was over. As they entered the building, Clara and Daniel felt the tension rise. Beatriz was not alone. She had surrounded herself with allies, people who benefited from her scheme and would do anything to protect their own interests. But Clara and Daniel were ready to face the truth, and they were aware that, as difficult as it might be, the only way forward was to keep going. Beatriz was in her office when Clara, Daniel, and Marcos entered unannounced. She looked at them with a fake smile, trying to maintain her sense of superiority. "I knew you would come," Beatriz said with a tone of disdain. But instead of being intimidated, Clara stared directly at her, without hesitation. "The truth is going to come out, Beatriz. No matter what you do, we're here to expose you and everything you've done. The game is over." Beatriz tried to destabilize them, using her sharp words and arrogant attitude. "You think you have control. I can destroy all of your lives with a simple move. You have no idea what you're facing." Her confidence was in control, but Clara knew that confidence was about to crumble. What Beatriz didn't understand was that she wasn't dealing with the woman she had humiliated in the past anymore. She was dealing with someone who finally knew who she was and what she deserved. Marcos, with the help of documents and recordings of compromising conversations, handed the evidence to Beatriz. "Everything you've done, Beatriz, is here. Your frauds, your manipulation, your web of lies. You can't hide what you've done anymore. Justice will prevail." The shock was visible on Beatriz's face. She knew she was lost. There was no escape anymore. The truth was right in front of her, and there was no power or influence she could use to change that. But the fight was still not over. In one last desperate act, Beatriz tried to flee, but the system she had created was crumbling around her. Clara and Daniel watched as she tried to escape the consequences of her actions. But there was nowhere left to hide. The police arrived, and the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Beatriz was finally arrested, and her web of lies began to disintegrate. Clara, witnessing all of this, felt a wave of relief and fulfillment. She was no longer a prisoner of her own doubts or Beatriz's power. She had won, and more importantly, she had freed herself from the chains of the past. Daniel was by her side, and she knew this victory was theirs together. But at the same time, something inside her knew that the greatest challenge had already been conquered. She had faced her own insecurities and her deepest wounds. Now, the path ahead was open. Clara's past, although painful, no longer defined her future. She and Daniel were finally free to build the life they deserved, and although the future was uncertain, their journey would make them stronger with every step. Together, they could face any adversity with the confidence that truth and justice, when sought with courage, would always prevail. The police arrived, and the sound of sirens echoed through the halls of the building where Beatriz had always felt invincible. But now, there was no more safety for her. Clara and Daniel, watching from a distance, felt the weight of what they had achieved. What once seemed like an endless nightmare was now transforming into an undeniable victory. The truth was being exposed publicly, and Beatriz, who had always believed herself above the law, was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Beatriz was handcuffed and escorted out of the building, her face expressionless, but her eyes showed the frustration of someone who knew everything she had built was crumbling. She tried in vain to speak to Daniel, attempting once again to manipulate the situation. "You'll lose me too, Daniel. Don't think I'll let this go just like that," she said with a bitter smile. But Daniel didn't give in. He simply looked at her with a cold expression. He knew this moment marked the end of everything she had represented to him. Clara watched what was happening with a renewed sense of power. She didn't feel hatred for Beatriz, nor anger. She felt something deeper, compassion. The woman she once saw as a monster now seemed like a victim of her own lies. The control Beatriz had tried to exert over others was now being used against her. Clara knew she couldn't change the past, but she could finally move on. The cycle of fear and humiliation Beatriz had created around her had come to an end. Daniel approached Clara and held her hand tightly. They no longer needed words. Their journey had brought them here, and as Beatriz was taken to prison, Daniel knew he was finally free from his own emotional prison. He felt a peace he never imagined possible. He didn't have to live under the shadow of Beatriz's manipulation anymore. He had found his own path, and Clara, with her courage and truth, was the key to his redemption. As the chaos unfolded around them, Clara and Daniel moved to a quieter corner. They didn't want to watch what was left of Beatriz because they knew this confrontation wasn't about her. It was about them, the strength they had found in each other, the new life they were about to begin. They knew that from that moment on, their choices would be based on what truly mattered: freedom, truth, and mutual respect. Clara turned to Daniel and with a soft smile said, "I never thought I would get this far. I never imagined I'd be able to fight back, but now I know who I am, and there's nothing holding me back anymore." Daniel smiled back. The admiration in his eyes was undeniable. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that with Clara by his side, he had something more precious than any material possession: a true companion, someone with whom he could share an authentic and meaningful life. The two of them left the building together, leaving behind the prison of the past and walking toward an uncertain but full of possibilities future. The air felt lighter, and Clara, for the first time, felt that life was finally within her reach. The battle for truth and freedom had been won, and though the road ahead would be challenging, she knew that with Daniel by her side, she was no longer alone. After Beatriz's arrest, the city seemed to breathe more calmly. The cycle of manipulation and control that had involved Clara and Daniel for so long had finally been broken. But for Clara, relief didn't come immediately. In her heart, there was still a sense of uncertainty. The threats from Beatriz, the phone calls, the constant feeling of being stalked, everything was still fresh in her memory. Although the greatest obstacle had been overcome, she knew that the road to recovery would be long. As Beatriz was taken to court, the media crowded around the case. Daniel, who had always been seen as a successful, unbeatable millionaire, was now at the center of a completely different narrative. The cameras followed him, but how he behaved was a great surprise to everyone. Instead of hiding behind his wealth or status, Daniel was genuinely interested in rebuilding the image that had been distorted by years of living with Beatriz. He knew that his life needed to change radically, not only regarding his career, but also in his personal life. Clara, on the other hand, was dealing with the emotional weight of having overcome something so big. She couldn't just return to her old life as if nothing had happened. Each day, she reflected on the lessons she had learned, on the strong woman she had become by facing her greatest fears. She felt more authentic, more capable, but the sense of being in control of her life was still too new to be fully understood. Despite the difficulties they were both facing, Daniel and Clara began to form a new dynamic between them. What started as a friendship forged in adversity was now transforming into something deeper. They shared dreams, desires, and even insecurities that had been hidden before. The truth had set them free, but there was still much to be done. Clara couldn't forget everything she had been through, and Daniel also knew he couldn't ignore the complications that were still to come. The first big consequence was the need to rebuild the trust of those around them. Clara knew that her name would, in some way, remain tied to the scandal. But she also knew she had the power to change her own narrative. She began speaking at public events, sharing her story, encouraging others to never give up, no matter the circumstances. Her journey inspired others, and without realizing it, Clara became an important figure in the fight for emotional freedom and justice. Daniel, on his part, found himself involved in a series of reforms at his own company. He knew he couldn't continue with the same lifestyle he had led before. Transparency and ethics were now the banners he would raise, not just in his personal life, but also in his work. Beatriz's influence on his career had distorted his view of success, and he was ready to give it a new meaning. Though many challenges remained, especially related to Clara's recovery and Daniel's adjustment to his new reality, both were walking towards something they had never imagined. No longer prisoners of Beatriz's lies, they were free to write their own story. With each step, they felt more confident, knowing that with courage and truth, they could overcome any adversity. Meanwhile, Beatriz faced the consequences of her actions. Her empire of lies was collapsing, and she could no longer manipulate anyone. Her arrest was just the beginning of a long judicial process that would gradually reveal the extensive frauds and crimes she had committed. But for Clara and Daniel, this no longer mattered. They were more focused on rebuilding their own lives. Over time, the weight of pain and humiliation diminished, replaced by the feeling of justice achieved. They were now ready to live a new life. And even with the challenges ahead, Clara and Daniel knew that together they could face anything the future had in store. They had won the most important battle, the fight for freedom, truth, and the recovery of their own power. Clara and Daniel, now more at peace with the resolution of Beatriz's case, found themselves in a new cycle of reflection on everything they had experienced. Both knew that their lives would never be the same. The pain, the fight for truth, and the confrontation of their own insecurities had transformed their perspectives. Clara, in particular, spent many nights reflecting on how much her journey had shaped her, how she had become stronger, wiser, and more aware of her own limitations, and how much she was capable of overcoming them. She often found herself standing in front of the mirror, analyzing who she was now. The fragile, fearful woman who once hid in a corner of a park bench was now in control of her own story. But that didn't mean she didn't have scars. The wounds of the past, although healed, were still a part of her, and Clara knew that by learning to live with those scars, she could finally find peace. It wasn't about erasing what happened, but accepting it as part of her journey. "I used to think scars were something to hide, Daniel," Clara once said during an intimate conversation while they sat in her new apartment, a place she had begun to feel was her home. "But after everything, I realize they are what made me who I am. They are what allow me to move forward with my head held high, not afraid of who I am or what I've been through." Daniel, who was also on his own journey of self-discovery, smiled. He felt the same. He too had his own scars, not physical, but emotional ones, those he had carried in secret for so long. He had spent his life being molded by his wealth and status, believing that these things would define him. But in the end, what really mattered was who he was on the inside. Now, by Clara's side, he felt he was finding the true version of himself, someone more honest, more vulnerable, but also stronger. Daniel never imagined that his relationship with Clara, which had started with a simple intention of helping her, would turn into something so deep. He felt that by helping her rebuild, he was also healing. He, who had once cared more about the image he portrayed to the world, now found himself free of the expectations he had carried for years. He knew that with Clara, he could start something new, something genuine, without fear, without masks. Together, they reflected on what they had learned from each other. Clara, with her courage and determination, taught Daniel to be more authentic, to allow himself to be vulnerable, and not to fear exposing his true essence. On the other hand, Daniel showed Clara the importance of valuing what she had achieved and not letting the past define her. Their journey was not just about confronting Beatriz, but about rediscovering themselves and rebuilding from the ruins of who they once were. Their healing process didn't happen overnight. There was still much to work on, many insecurities to overcome. But the trust they had in each other was the foundation for them to continue moving forward. They began to dream together again, with new projects, with a new life, but this time they knew that the true wealth lay in what couldn't be bought: love, truth, and freedom. Clara began to get involved in social causes, helping women in situations similar to hers. She knew her experience had immense value, and she could inspire and help others rise again. Daniel, on his part, began a series of changes in his company, focusing on more sustainable and ethical practices, distancing himself from the toxic corporate world that had always surrounded him. He wanted his new life to reflect what he now believed to be most important: transparency, honesty, and above all, the pursuit of truth. As they walked together into this new phase, Clara and Daniel began to realize that what truly mattered wasn't the external victories or the amount of money they had, but the ability to remain true to themselves. They were at peace, not because everything was resolved, but because they had learned to live with uncertainties and embrace challenges with courage and resilience. What the future would bring was still a mystery, but Clara and Daniel were ready to face it, together. They knew that their true journey was just beginning. A few weeks later, Clara and Daniel found themselves in a situation they both feared, but knew they would eventually need to face. Throughout their journey, Clara had distanced herself from most of her family. She felt betrayed by those who never noticed the struggles she had been through, and Beatriz's departure had only deepened this estrangement. But as Clara healed and her new sense of identity took shape, she knew that forgiveness was the key to closing this chapter. Not just forgiving Beatriz, but forgiving those who had ignored her. The decisive moment came when her mother, Donna Isabel, contacted Clara for the first time in months. She was concerned about her daughter's well-being, who had been distant for so long. Donna Isabel had refused to believe that Clara, so strong and independent, was silently suffering. But realizing her daughter's pain was real, she finally sought the opportunity to reconcile. Clara hesitated when she heard her mother's voice on the other end of the line. She knew their relationship would never be the same, but she also knew she had to take this step. She was torn between the desire to continue her life without looking back and the need to heal the wounds that had been left open. "I don't know, Mom," I don't know if we can go back to what we were, Clara said, her voice heavy with emotion. Donna Isabel, with a gentle tone, responded, Clara, I loved you with all my heart. I know I failed you, but all I want now is for you to allow me to be a part of your life again. I don't need explanations. I don't need you to tell me everything. I just want you to know that I'm here. Her mother's words touched a deep place within Clara. She knew her mother was genuinely sorry, and this made her realize that the only thing holding her back from the past was her own pride. Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She no longer needed to carry the burden of pain alone. She decided that forgiveness was necessary, not only for her mother's healing, but for her own as well. When Clara and Donna Isabel met, the reunion was tense at first, but soon turned into a deep conversation. They shared their fears, failures, and hurts. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was an important step toward rebuilding their relationship. Clara understood that her mother also had her own demons, which had distanced her from Clara in a way as silent as Beatriz's estrangement. And by hearing what Donna Isabel had to say, Clara realized that to move forward, she couldn't cling to the hurts of the past anymore. The forgiveness wasn't immediate, but it was a process of small changes, understanding and accepting each other's flaws, and recognizing that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply to accept and be present. Clara didn't need her mother to redeem herself for everything that had happened. She just needed to feel that she could let go of the years of silence and no longer be a victim of that story. Daniel was by Clara's side throughout this process. He knew that this reunion with her mother was crucial for her, but he also knew that Clara's healing process didn't depend on anyone else but herself. He supported her, but he knew Clara needed to do this for her, not for anyone else. You're doing what's right, Clara. I'm here for whatever you need, Daniel said tenderly. He knew that this forgiveness, this reconciliation with the past, would bring peace to Clara, and she could finally move forward. After her reunion with her mother, Clara felt a significant change within herself. She not only forgave Beatriz and her mother, but also forgave herself for everything she had neglected to do to take care of herself. She began to give herself permission to be happy, without guilt, without fear. What remained now was the opportunity to live fully with the strength she had discovered within herself and with Daniel by her side, supporting her every step of the way. Clara's journey was far from easy, but she knew that forgiveness had been the key to opening the doors to a new beginning. She no longer viewed life through the lens of suffering and pain. Now, she saw a future full of possibilities, and with Daniel, she felt that she could achieve anything. What they had built together was a new foundation, a new life, and Clara knew that at last she was ready for freedom. With forgiveness achieved, Clara and Daniel were ready to take the next steps. What had started as a fight for survival was now transforming into a journey of rebuilding. Justice had been served, but for both of them, the greatest prize was not just Beatriz's imprisonment or the exposure of her frauds, but the freedom they had found by facing their own fears and limitations. The fight for justice was an important part of their story, but the real reward lay in the internal transformation that both experienced. The impact of Beatriz's case didn't stop with her arrest. The scandal gained media attention, and the revelation of her involvement in fraud and manipulation was exposed to the public in an unforgiving manner. Clara and Daniel, who had previously been background figures in the narrative, were now at the center, not as victims, but as survivors and agents of change. Clara was invited to interviews and debates, where she shared her story of overcoming adversity and the importance of standing firm even in the most difficult circumstances. Her voice, once silent, now echoed throughout the city, inspiring many who were going through similar situations. Meanwhile, Daniel, who had always been used to being seen as the successful millionaire, now found himself in a new role. He distanced himself from the business empire that once dominated his life and began focusing on social causes. His company was restructured, adopting a new philosophy that sought not only profits, but also a positive impact on society. He knew he could no longer be tied to the image of power and wealth he once chased. His new purpose was simpler, but much more fulfilling, to be a force of change, alongside Clara, for a fairer world. The justice of Beatriz being exposed publicly also sparked a wave of reactions. Those who had been manipulated by her, who were once pawns in her game, now found themselves free. The scandal not only brought down Beatriz, but also revealed a larger network of corruption that affected many people around her. Clara and Daniel felt they were part of something much greater than their own lives. They had been catalysts for a profound societal change, a movement that could not be ignored. The impact on Clara's life was deeper than she had imagined. The woman who, years earlier, walked the streets feeling that nothing mattered, now felt empowered and ready to face the world with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was. She became more actively involved in support groups for women who were victims of emotional and financial abuse. What she had learned in her own battle could not be kept secret. She was determined to help other women find the strength she had discovered within herself. Daniel, for his part, experienced the emotional reward he had long sought, but in a way he hadn't imagined. He felt a peace he had never felt before. The forgiveness he had given Beatriz and the deep understanding of his own shortcomings made him feel more human. He no longer needed to hide his vulnerability to be accepted. By Clara's side, he had found not only true love, but a partnership that transcended anything he had ever imagined. Together, they began to plan their future, no longer as isolated figures in a world of status and wealth, but as a couple who shared dreams, pains, and ambitions. Life, which once seemed uncertain and filled with insurmountable obstacles, now unfolded before them with infinite possibilities. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but they were ready to face them. While justice was served, the greatest prize was the peace that Clara and Daniel had achieved. They were no longer prisoners of their past. The love they had cultivated between them and the courage they had developed throughout their journey made them stronger, more resilient, and more ready to face whatever came next. Clara and Daniel were in a new chapter of their lives, a chapter where the pain of the past no longer dictated their actions. Each of them began to rediscover what truly mattered. Clara, now with a powerful voice, dedicated herself entirely to social causes, working with women in vulnerable situations and abuse. She used her own experience to help others rise again, giving lectures and creating emotional support programs. She felt that she was finally fulfilling her life's mission, helping other women break free from the chains of psychological and financial abuse, just as she had done. Daniel, for his part, began to distance himself more and more from the traditional business world. He transformed his fortune into a foundation dedicated to supporting young entrepreneurs in underserved areas. He knew that by doing this, he was giving back to the world part of what life had given him. The foundation, which he started with Clara by his side, quickly became a model of success. They not only wanted to provide financial support, but also transform mindsets, offering young people the opportunity to build their own businesses and, more importantly, the confidence to follow their own paths. Together, they also created a mentorship program to help women who were starting their own journeys in the corporate world, offering the guidance Clara never had. They created a safe and welcoming environment for those who needed support to achieve their professional goals. The idea of helping to build a network of successful women and men, but also conscious of their social responsibility, became a shared passion for Clara and Daniel. While Clara was immersed in her social transformation work, Daniel began a series of trips to learn about projects in other countries. He wanted to better understand global challenges and how he could expand the reach of his foundation. During one of these trips, he had the opportunity to meet communities abroad that, like him, had overcome adversity. He was deeply moved by the resilience of these people, which motivated him even more to continue his work in Brazil and around the world. The truth, which once seemed painful and full of losses, now guided them toward a future of discovery and growth. Clara and Daniel, by moving away from what had trapped them for so long, found the true meaning of freedom, the ability to be themselves, without masks, without external pressures, only with the determination to live authentically. And with this, they created something that neither Beatrice nor any other enemy from the past could destroy, a shared life of purpose, peace, and love. The couple, once involved in constant drama and struggle, now walked side by side toward a promising future, where the scars were no longer a burden, but a testament to their strength. They were building not only a legacy of financial success, but a legacy of genuine social impact. As they walked this new path together, Clara and Daniel felt that they had rediscovered not only each other, but what truly mattered. The future, full of possibilities, no longer seemed scary or uncertain. They knew that together they could face anything because, more than anything, they were now free. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the city where Clara and Daniel had begun their journey together. Those quiet moments, away from the complications of their past, were now more frequent than ever. What once seemed like an uncertain future, full of challenges and fear, now appeared as a clear path, filled with purpose and renewed confidence. Clara looked at Daniel, who was by her side, smiling softly, and felt a wave of gratitude. They had traveled a long and painful journey, but one that was also rich in lessons and transformations. She reflected on how much she had changed since meeting Daniel, since that day when she was lost and alone, not knowing what her next step would be. She had faced her greatest fears, confronted the ghosts of the past, and finally freed herself from her own chains. She knew her life would never be the same, but not because of the weight of pain, but because of the strength she had found within herself. True freedom didn't come from the absence of problems, but from the ability to face them with head held high. Daniel, by her side, was also reflecting on his own transformation. He never imagined that meeting Clara, which initially seemed like just a way to help her, would lead him on such a deep journey of self-discovery. He had freed himself from the expectations of being the successful man society said he should be, and now he found himself guided by a much more important mission: to live a genuine life with meaning. The friendship with Clara had transformed into a love he never knew was possible. But more than that, he found in her a partnership based on respect, support, and honesty. Together, they became a force for change, not just for themselves, but for the society around them. Clara and Daniel knew that the true reward of life wasn't in recognition, possessions, or status. The greatest prize was in the choices they made every day, the courage to rise after a fall and keep moving forward, even when the future seemed uncertain. They had overcome not only Beatriz, but also their own limitations, fears, and insecurities. The world that once seemed oppressive and full of obstacles now appeared as an open field, filled with possibilities. Clara and Daniel knew that by choosing the path of truth, courage, and forgiveness, they had chosen freedom. And with that freedom, they could create a future together, where the scars were no longer a burden, but a symbol of the journey they had taken to get there. Now, with the wind of change at their backs, they were ready for anything, no longer enslaved by the past or others' expectations, but free to shape their own story. Clara, with a serene smile, held Daniel's hand, knowing that despite the challenges that might arise, they would never be defeated again. "We won, Daniel, and with that, we've gained more than anyone could imagine, our own freedom." Daniel looked at her, his sincere smile reflecting the confidence they both had found. "Yes, Clara, and now, together, we'll conquer whatever comes next. The future is ours." And so, together, they walked into a new chapter of their lives, ready for whatever life had in store, knowing that now, nothing could stop them.